You may notice there's some boxes in the back of this slide. I'm the mom of a teenager whom I hope will, in the not too distant future, leave my home, go out into the world, and become independent. When that happens, I want him, as a very complex, bright, and creative thinker, to have a toolbox that he can use to actually independently chart his own course through a work very different from the one that I graduated into. A post-Google world in which we can look up facts and figures we don't know, but we need to know how to work with those facts. We have opportunities to create things that were never even contemplated previously. And I'm not coming along. When he goes to college, I do not plan to go. So he needs to have a toolbox that will allow him to independently go out into the world on his own and feel empowered to be able to chart his own course. Look how big the problems are that our kids are going to have the opportunity to solve. It is definitely a changed world, but one in which, I use this phrase opportunities to solve very carefully, because that's exciting, right? For really bright, creative thinkers who have high analytical skills, this is like mind candy to solve big, hard problems. And it's overwhelming. And we need a process to learn how to do that. So if we kind of reverse engineer from there, if we're going to solve these big problems, then our teens are going to need to have the ability to process massive amounts of information, to collaborate with people who are all over the world, and to think flexibly and constantly be testing their assumptions. To do that is going to require some foundational skills. They're going to have to know how to optimize their own thoughts, how to sustainably care for their own bodies, which, as we all know, just thinking about how, for instance, Google, how their offices have sit-stand desks and exercise equipment built in, because the knowledge economy is actually very demanding on us as humans. And they also have to know how to access their own creative minds. So if we're going to pull that off for kids who are not only super, super bright, but also have areas of difference that stand in their way, then we're going to have to start breaking down those barriers that stand in their way. And as we go through today, you'll see some of the kinds of barriers that we're referring to and how we go about addressing them. So there are three major components to our program, and this gets integrated, as you'll see, into a project-based learning framework. So we have standards-based academics. Let me emphasize that, standards-based academics. So we start with the Connecticut academic standards and next generation science standards. And we start with saying, for this child, what is their appropriate next step skill? Bearing in mind that some of these kids may be 2 grade levels ahead in reading, 2 grade levels behind in math, or the flip. So we're not looking to say, oh, well, look, you already happen to have met the 10th grade standards, so no math this year. No, it doesn't work that way. So what is the next step that they are going to be learning towards? The second major component is personal growth. And that comes through embedded therapies and expertise, and some very unique approaches to that by applying modern neuroscience. And then the third component is agency. And this, to me, is perhaps the most important piece. When I went looking at special education schools in the area, this was the piece that I felt I was most missing as I looked at the program options, is to have a focus on not just teaching to the way that your child learns, for instance, but giving your child the understanding, the intellectual understanding that they need to take charge of these tools for themselves. So we'll share how it is that we go about that as well. So starting with the academics, these are not just, academics writ large. This is academics specifically tailored to stimulate and empower students who walk in the door with very high analytical skills. Many of these kids are facing challenges specifically because their analytical reasoning skills were so high when they were younger that they just never had to learn how to study, or they never had to learn how to organize and outline. Now they're hitting curriculum that does demand more than what they can do through their own innate abilities, and that's where you start to see the real challenges. We need to address and solve those challenges before it becomes an impediment in college and in limiting their future opportunities as professionals. As we think about, or as we sat down to design what this academic program would look like, we started from one very important philosophical idea, which is that the kids that we are looking to bring into our program are ones who, yes, have phenomenal potential as future professionals, but why stop there? If you come into this world differently wired on two different axes, both outlying strengths and meaningful differences from the other kids around you, you are going to develop perspectives on this world that are simply different. When we are kids, we look at that as, oh, he doesn't fit. When we are adults, we look at that as innovation. So what we are designing is an academic program that is specifically intended to help develop the skills that you need to not to try to fit in with your unusual ways of seeing the world, but to pick those up, develop them, and carry them forward as future thought leaders. Just like twice exceptional thinkers before, such as Santiago Ramon y Cajal, the neuroscientist that our school is named after, Steven Spielberg, Agatha Christie, Albert Einstein, some of the greatest leaders in our mathematics, science, academic, arts, and culture have been in that position specifically because of the uniqueness of their perspectives. So we don't want to hide those things. So going back to what we said before, we've got some skills that we're going to need to have in order to be able to solve these big problems or take these innovative ideas and turn them into thought leadership. So being able to organize large amounts of information, being able to communicate with others and collaboratively problem solve, and being able to think flexibly and with very high critical thinking. It will not surprise you to hear that that is one of the design principles behind, or the primary design principles behind our academic programming. So to go about this, rather than using a traditional academic content framework, we are using multidisciplinary project-based learning. Now, this is a framework that has been developed by the Bucks Institute and others for decades. And it is already, there are schools all across the country that are both mainstream and special education schools that are using this framework. So project-based learning starts with a real-world problem. And here we can think of our saguaro cactus here from any number of problems, right? It could relate to environmental change, it could relate to immigration policy, etc. So you start with a real-world problem, and then the kids work together to identify, what do we need to know in order to answer that problem? And then they together determine, so how can I get that information? Are there experiments that I can run? Is there research that I can do? Is there an expert that I can talk to? The role of the educator is to help give access and facilitation to getting that information, and also to be constantly asking questions to probe the children's thinking, to help them to delve deeper, think deeper into the problem, and as well as into their solutions as they develop them. So the next step is they have to work together as a team to develop a solution. You may be starting to see here how this framework is directly correlated to identified are going to be critical to being able to go forward as these independent thinkers in post-Google world, where we are not rewarded for being able to remember facts and figures, but being able to work with them and make something of them. How can we test our solution to make sure that it works? How can we improve upon our solution and iterate? And then ultimately, how can we communicate the solution to others? Now, as I went through that process, you will be forgiven if you're thinking to yourself, that takes a lot of executive function skills, and I'm not sure that my teenager has them just yet. That, my friends, is the point. We wanted to use an academic framework that acts as a natural laboratory within which to develop the skills that we think are most essential to 21st century success, and specifically for this group of kids. Many of these children struggle, as I mentioned before, with social skills. So having a collaborative framework as opposed to individualized framework for academic learning means that we've created that natural laboratory within which to work on social skills. And actually in our summer program last summer, Dr. Mattis co-taught our project-based learning studio so that he was right there on hand to support students not only with the social skills components to help them develop the ability to really collaborate with their peers, but also to help with executive function challenges as they were arising. And this is an example of how we integrate together both our academic instruction with our appreciation of the specific therapeutic goals that we have in mind for each child. And I'll tell you about how those goals get developed. So as we're choosing the specific problems and projects that we are going to work on for a given year. Now, these are long arc projects. We're currently working on a project, which I'll share in a moment, that will go on for the remainder of this school year, I expect. The projects, it's not, oh, what a cool project. What could we teach? We start the other way around. We start with those three main curricular components that I mentioned before, the standards-based academics, personalized growth goals, and then our agency curriculum. And we say, okay, what are the specific standards that need to be taught as the appropriate next steps for these kids? And then what real world problem can they work on that will integrate those standards and become an appropriate delivery mechanism, essentially, for us to provide that curriculum? So these project elements, you'll see, is a broad arc project that has within it multiple different components that weave together as a theme across what is really a very traditional looking school day. So the kids are going to content skills classes, core skills classes that align to Connecticut high school graduation requirements for the public school environment. So we, as an independent school, we are not beholden to those graduation requirements, but we think there's a lot of value in going to those same core skills classes. Within those core skills classes, though, they are working to and gaining this same content within the project-based learning in pursuit of solving this real world problem. So why do it that way? Well, tell me if you've heard this one. Mom, why do I need to learn this stuff? When am I ever going to use this? If that phrase has ever been uttered in your household, then you know why we're doing it this way. This immediately provides a real world purposeful learning context for the kids. And that alone makes it more interesting and exciting to engage, and also immediately lends itself to greater depth of exploration. Because if we're not just memorizing to learn how to take a test, but rather we're trying to solve a real world problem, then there are infinite depths of knowledge that become interesting and available. And we will actually bring in outside industry experts to provide mentorship or instruction, so that if there is a student who has a specific area of interest or talent, that there is no ceiling to them being able to pursue that, which is particularly important, I think, at the high school level. So to give you an example of what all of this looks like in the day-to-day, here's the project that we're currently working on. We're actually working on understanding how you can make a sci-fi movie really realistic, or how you can make a really bad sci-fi movie instead. As part of this project, the kids are developing alien creatures that have a realistic chance of surviving in an Earth-like biome. In the process of doing that, they are learning a great deal about environmental science and Earth-like biomes. They're also learning about genetics, about animal adaptations, about the biomechanics of how different creatures move. For the children in the program, they all have PT and OT goals that relate to their own biomechanics. So learning that content in the form of an academic piece of information that you're then going to creatively apply in creating this creature, that is less sort of less weighted, if you will, than learning it in a purely therapeutic setting. The kids are learning about screenwriting and about what they're reading, books that were then sci-fi books that were turned into sci-fi movies, and then we'll be writing comparison papers. Every child going through school has to write some number of critiques and comparison papers. This is again an example of how it gets directly integrated into the project-based learning by having that comparison be written about the topic of the learning project itself. They're actually going to be using math to animate their creatures. through curriculum that was created by Pixar in a Box together with Khan Academy, which we've integrated into this project, and even composing parts of a screen score to convey different movie moods, etc. So as you can see, in the course of doing this project, which has a certain appeal to it, they're actually getting an awful lot of different academic and therapeutic strategies and content rather and skills integrated together. So there's a lot of STEM content in this project, also language arts content and arts content, in addition to great deal of work around self-awareness, both on the physiological side, but also on the social emotional side, and talking about experiences of feeling alien within an environment, and also just even thinking about how the experience of COVID has changed all of our understandings of our environment and how hospitable our environment may or may not be for us as well. So that just gives you one example of how the project-based learning framework, how we're using it to bring all of these elements together.